So once again, good morning, good afternoon to you all, wherever you are, and welcome to the first edition of the Global Markets Encounter series for 2021. Happy to meet you all again. As always, let me take a moment to give you some housekeeping rules. First of all, kindly let us use the chat feature for networking and also use the Q&A for questions and answers. Secondly, let us also use the hand raise feature for all the at times that we want to draw attention for an issue to be addressed for us. Thirdly, to select the language of our choice, there is the interpretation feature at the bottom right corner. Select the language that you want to use, and if you don't want to hear the background information, select to also mute the original language. Before we proceed, let me take the opportunity to acknowledge our sponsors and partners who have made this possible by giving us the support we need to come over to you wherever you are. First of all, Intersnack Procurement, we thank you so much. Appreciation also to Pro Cashew, SNI Sustainable Nuts Initiative, Com Cashew, Cashew Info, and the Benin Cashew Project. Thank you all for your support. As always, we are live and we are coming to you from Facebook, MS Teams, and YouTube. And we will be introducing other more platforms which will make it easy for you to join us and to participate in what we are doing here. For today's session, the topic will be New Cashew World Outlook for 2021. We have had all these forums running last year, and we saw the situation for 2020. We will review them briefly and then delve deep into what we look or what we think will be the outlook for 2021. And I'll now go straight to invite our regular host and cashew expert, Jim Fitzpatrick, who needs no introduction. He is an expert for many years, 35 years on this kind of job, and has been supporting the African Cashew Alliance to put up together all this information that we bring to you. And he's done justice to the topic over the several months and several years that we've worked with him. And at this point, without much ado, we would like to welcome Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, are you over there? Lovely.
Good morning.
It's been a long time since I've seen you. It's good to see the face again. We are always talking on phone.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. It's good to be with you again. Is it really a year since we heard about this virus?
Exactly.
Is it really a year since there were these rumors coming out of China? It's hard to believe, isn't it?
Today it's still getting really out of hand in many places, and we are hoping that our participants are all staying safe, adhering to whatever protocols are there in whichever countries they are in, and to make sure that everybody is safe and sound. So maybe, Jim, you take over now, you tell us the situation where you are, and then you dive deep into the topic for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ernest. Thank you, Ernest. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back with you again. We've had a nice break from these encounters. Today we're going to talk about the big picture. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek to call it Welcome to the New Cashew World. But there are a lot of new things, and there are a lot of interesting changes that have come about over the last 12 months. So we look at the big picture, and then we look at some more closely at some topics. So what I propose to look at today is demand, an overview of demand. I look at the long-term impact of the pandemic, as well as the short-term impact. I'll have a look at the overview of production for 2021, insofar as that we know it as we come to the middle of February, and the outlook for the year ahead, 2021, and a little bit beyond that. Some of the big trends going forward. So let's remind ourselves, first of all, of some of the big picture items arising from 2020. And in many ways, although it was a very disrupted year, Although it was a very difficult year, particularly for processors, it was also quite a strong year in the cashew sector. And if we just look at some of the numbers, if we think about cashew kernels, looking at the top 30 countries, which covers more than 85% of world demand on imports, 23 of those countries showed growth in imports in 2020. We never would have expected that this time last year. We see it expressed in Vietnamese exports, which are up 11%. And we see a continuation of the trend where Indian exports decline, with Indian exports dropping off sharply last year, partly due to the pandemic and partly due to underlying trends. If we look at production, it wasn't actually in the end as bad a year as feared from a production point of view. Production in 2020 was a little bit better than in 2019, mainly due to increased crops in the Southeast Asian countries, but also due to a very good crop in parts of West Africa, particularly Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Ghana, all had pretty good crops. So although we were very concerned about how that product would make it to the market, it did. And if we look at the RCN trade last year, it hit 2.5 million tons. Most of that to Vietnam, 1.4 million tons, which was a drop on the previous year. But India, I don't have the final figures for December, but India looks like if it will meet similar figures to 2019, around 850,000 tons of imports. That again that's really quite remarkable, and it's a testament really, I think, to the fact that African countries, West African countries especially, were less affected and less disrupted than some of the more developed countries. And looking at the ability to move the product, although it moved slowly, it has to be said. And if you look at imports into India and Vietnam during November and December, you still see shipments going on that normally would have been finished a couple of months earlier. I suppose the good news in a very difficult year was that more people ate more cashews in more countries than ever before. That's quite remarkable. It says a lot about this product. It says a lot about the demand for this product. So I think that the new cashew world and how we view it is all about demand. It's all about what is going on with consumers, what is going on in the destination countries and the consuming countries on demand. I'm just wondering if I may ask, is there a problem with the sharing of the slide at the moment?
Jim, there's no problem. Kindly go ahead. We can hear you.
And you can see the slide?
Okay, no, share it. Sorry. The slide was clear. You just took it off.
I'll reshare it now.
Yes, please. Reshare it.
Okay, there it is. Sorry about that.
And the French version will be in the chat box very soon. So please go ahead.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. As I was saying, more people ate more cashews in more countries than ever before, and that's got to be good news, especially in such a difficult year. But prices crashed. The prices of cashew kernels literally crashed early in the year, as we can see. Processors' margins fell. Those who had forward sales did quite well and relied on them. Those who left their purchasing a little bit later had a pretty good time towards the end of the year. We did see a lot more buying and a lot more interest to buy in West Africa. But this is surprising. Bear in mind, I've said 23 of 30 countries increased their imports. The largest suppliers' exports went up by more than 11%, and yet prices fell. And when they fell, they stayed down. They were a little bounce towards the end of the year, but compared to our expectations early in the year when 320s were still around about $3.20 and expected to rise, this was very surprising. So we have to ask the question, is this the new cashew world? Record demand and low kernels prices. Let's have a look at that demand. Let's see exactly what's been going on over 2020 and into the early part of this year on demand and consumption. We're going to start with the US market. But first, I'll take a quick look at global demand. And just to assure you that this trend is positive and has been going up, we're looking at increased global demand for cashew kernels every year since 2011. It's a strong, deep trend that's not really going to go away. And if we look at 2020, we'll see that the actual consumption is a little bit below the trend line. That's the impact of the pandemic. But this trend line would appear to continue, soon to hit 1 million tons. And if we look at some of the growth rates in a moment, you'll see why. So let's look at the US now. So a big question would be, after a pretty good year in 2020, how will the US market react in 2021? If we look at the trend, so what you're seeing on your screen is month by month imports over 3 years, cumulative as the year goes on. So that's why it rises from left to right. It's the cumulative imports over the year. And what we can see is that it's always ahead of the previous year, and that this accelerated in 2020. If we look at that, just the 2 years, 2019 and 2020, and try and focus in on exactly what happened in 2020, we see, again, a very, very strong start, and then we see a pandemic impact. And that's in the early part of the year, particularly imports in April and May. So those imports, April, May, June, all of which were very much ahead of the previous year. In those 3 months, those would have been shipments from February, March, April. So there were two things going on. There were people buying additional product, and there were people accelerating shipments for fear that there would be a disruption to shipments and there would be a problem in Vietnam in processing. That was followed by a little bit of a lag. So over those months, in the middle of the year, July, August, we saw a correction. We saw a nervousness, and certainly in the United States, it was during that period that people started to realize that the pandemic was as serious as it has turned out to be. But the year finished quite strong. If we look October, indeed September, October, November, and December, each month was ahead of 2019. And 2019 wasn't a bad year. There was an increase in demand in 2019. But in the US, we had been seeing a very slow change in the market, very slow growth of less than 1% year on year since 2015. The market was behaving as quite a mature market. It was behaving as a market that was impacted by high prices in 2016 and 17. It was behaving as a market where demand was not going through the kind of major increases that we've seen elsewhere. However, the year did finish, the US imports were up by about 8%. 8% is fairly spectacular for the US market. We have seen growth spurts in individual years over the last 10 years, but we haven't seen 8% for a long, long time. The US is still the largest import market, importing around about 167,000 tons every year. So there could be an element in the US demand in 2020, there could be an element of a pandemic impact. This boost in demand followed by a lag could be a factor of the pandemic. The relatively good last quarter may tell us that there's something else going on there, that there's something quite strong underlying US demand, but we would ask the question that perhaps we wouldn't ask in other markets. Is this purely pandemic related? But we would have to say that this is the highest rise in consumption in 10 years. And we do know that the US market does react to price. It reacts to lower prices. It reacts to stable prices. And therefore, you might expect that in 2021, we would, in any case, see a reaction to those prices. In the US market, according to our analysis, it takes about 14 to 18 months for the impact of lower prices to really follow through into the market. So we would have expected a boost in demand in the last quarter of 2020 and the early part of 2021, regardless of the pandemic. Let's have a look at Europe, and I think this is the big story. And if things continue, the European market, that's the EU plus the UK, will be a bigger consumer than the US within a couple of years and possibly even this year. If we look at European demand, so what I've done here for comparison purposes, I've combined European Union, 27 countries, and the UK, so that we'll be able to see this going forward now that the UK has left. You can see quite a strong trend in demand. You can see a strong trend line. This was pre-pandemic. This is in no way is the European increase in imports of 17%. Although it's a big figure, it's consistent with what's been happening. So before the pandemic, we were seeing strong growth in demand, and we saw that again last year. At one stage in the year, the demand was absolutely spectacular. At one point, imports were up by 32%. But like the US, it settled down a little bit, and we still see this 17% increase in the year. This is driven by a lot of trends. I mean, this is driven by much deeper trends than we would place on the pandemic alone. Healthy eating, replacement of meat proteins with vegetable proteins, convenience, price stability has a big impact. Low prices certainly, but also price stability. And we've seen low to stable prices for a couple of years. In 2020, we saw the instability of a decline. And to put this in perspective, so the European market, the EU market, has for a long time been the second largest import market in the world. In 2015, the European market was about 75% in size of the US market. In 2020, it had risen to 98% of the US market. So the European and the US markets are now almost the same size. And that's driven by relatively slow growth in demand in the US and fast growth in demand in Europe. And these are not trends that tend to change quickly. So these are not trends at a consumer level. Higher prices are not necessarily likely to switch this off in Europe. People are not buying cashews based on the price alone. It has an impact, but there are other factors much more likely that they will continue to buy cashews, even if prices were to rise. Let's look at the trend in China. And what we see in China is a strengthening demand. So we've looked at Europe, we've looked at the US, and there's the trend in Chinese demand, the red bars. And what we see is strengthening demand in China. It's still nowhere near, and no market is even close to Indian consumption of cashews. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But China is growing. So we are seeing a strong development in demand from China. And that's evidenced last year. So the Chinese imports finished about 1.3% up on 2019. But we should factor into that there was about 4 to 6 weeks, around about this time last year, at the beginning of Chinese New Year, throughout the festival, essentially the border with Vietnam was closed. Imports of cashews were not moving. If we were to accept that, there was about 4,200 tons of trade in kernels to China lost during that period compared to the previous year. If we were to factor that in, we would have seen a 6% growth. in the Chinese market in Chinese imports. And that's significant. So that would mean that in 2018, 2019, and 2020, we've seen growth in consumption. And as you can see, if we look at the red bars on the table, it's not always been the case that there's been growth in the Chinese market. It has not always been taken for granted. And in truth, at a consumption of 80,000 tons for such a large population, it's probably true to say that cashews have not really taken off in China just yet. But it is a factor that has to be noted. So we looked at three big regions, three big importing regions. We've looked at still the largest, the US, 8% growth. We've looked at Europe, the second largest area, 17% growth, following on from 15% growth in 2019. And we've looked at China, where we see strong growth, but still at a relatively low base. Let's look at the biggest market, India. And if we look at Indian consumption, predictions early last year for Indian consumption, particularly during the period of the early lockdowns, the first lockdown in particular in India, business came to a standstill largely. And predictions for demand were poor. And in the early part of the year, many marketing opportunities were disrupted. India has a traditional retail system which normally works really well and responds very quickly to markets. But last year, of course, with the lockdown, it was unable to. However, it may be that Indian demand was a little bit better than we expected. My calculation was based, and you may remember if you attended some of these events last year, we worked on scenarios that Indian demand would be either 20% down or 30% down. And this projection here reflects that. But if we look at Indian imports, it looks like 2020 imports will hit somewhere just under 850,000 tons, similar figure to 2019. And that would mean that the difference would only be in the crop. So if we take that, and certainly Indian production was lower last year, mainly because of disruption, not necessarily because of any climatic or geographical factors. Take the imports, take the reduced exports, and remember Indian exports are down in 2020 by about 25%, something in the region of about 45,000 tons, I believe. And we just calculate that out, and that's what we've got to do in India because the nature of the market and the size of the market means that we need to calculate. That would suggest that demand was not as badly affected. So there's two possible situations. One, demand was not as badly affected as expected, or two, that there's a very large closing stock left in India, which to me seems unlikely. There is a stock in India, but it's not the kind of stock that would explain that difference. So my thinking is that the demand in India has not been as badly affected as we may have feared going back 10, 12 months ago. Again, that's very positive. So we're looking here at demand over the four major consuming regions. And we're seeing relatively positive to very positive news across all four. We could look at other areas. We could look at the Middle East, which was affected. UAE, Saudi, Lebanon were all affected, and demand was actually not that badly affected, but it was affected. We could look at individual markets, Australia, for example, where demand was very strong. I think imports were up in the region of 18% from Vietnam, where Australia buys most of its cashew kernels. We could look in East Asian markets, Japan, Taiwan, and all of those markets show relatively good returns. Of course, there is the trend there, and we're looking on the slide about India, but there is a trend during last year that due to restrictions in India, due to reduced processing, due to the effective closure of the markets over particularly the second quarter of the year, that markets in East Asia, traditional buyers of Indian kernels switched to Vietnam. So you'll see, for example, imports to Japan from Vietnam have increased. And these different factors are part of the reason why Vietnamese exports are so strong last year. And let's look at Vietnam, and let's just look at this balance situation in Vietnam. So one of the key factors at this time of year is the situation in Vietnam. So Vietnam is now entering, it's in the holiday season. It's in the Tet holiday season, which is a long holiday for most of the month of February. Looking at the balances in Vietnam. So this table is the balances in Vietnam calculated from the end of January last year to the end of January this year. And if we take the numbers, an estimate of the opening stock, an estimate of the crop, which in this case I've used 400,000 tons. The official figure from the Ministry of Agriculture is 390,000 tons, and the trade figure is again higher than that. If we look at the exports, 511,000 tons of kernels. Yeah, 511,000 tons of kernels were exported from Vietnam last year. It's unbelievable. That is a remarkable achievement. And if we look at the first month of the new year, we see the trend is continuing with very strong exports ahead of the holidays in Vietnam. We look at the imports. So we have imports, we have the actual import figures. So this is pretty much an actual figure. 1.4 million tons in 2020. Take away January 2020, add in January 2021, and this is what you come up with. And if we look at this situation, the stock is very, very tight in Vietnam. Now, there may be some transit stocks. That's for sure. And that's the question. What is in the country on ships, not yet showing in the import figures? And the volume of that material will determine how quickly Vietnamese buyers need to buy in Cambodia to refill the processing factories, because it's pretty clear processing exports is going to continue quite strong. So they need to be processing. So we're looking at quite a tight situation in Vietnam, quite a tight situation in India, because we think consumption was a little bit stronger than we originally thought. And we're looking at in West Africa, and if we look at the trade in RCN, 2.5 million tons, there is not the balances left that we feared might be left when we went back and we talked about this in March and April of last year, when we thought that there could be significant stocks left due to disruption. That hasn't really happened. There are some stocks, but they're not major stocks. So what does consumption, what does 2020 tell us about demand and supply? Well, it certainly tells us that demand is strong. It certainly tells us that there's more than COVID at play here. That this is not just a spike in demand driven by the pandemic factors. It tells us that demand has been very resilient in a crisis. In my opinion, it tells us that the price collapse was not demand driven. If demand was the only factor, prices would have gone up, not down. And it tells us, and we of course have to calculate this because we won't know for some time exactly what the stocks were at the end of the year. But based on calculations, it tells us that at the year end, the stocks in warehouses, stocks of RCN in warehouses around the world are probably at their lowest levels for 3 to 5 years. We do not have surplus in Tanzania as we did in previous 2 years. We do not have major stocks lying in India or in Vietnam at the end of the year. There is possibly enough material to go on with, possibly not. That depends, but it's a very tight situation. And we know in West Africa that more product was shipped than was anticipated earlier in the year. And therefore, again, it's reasonable to assume that stocks of old crop are low. I mean, there may be some stocks in Nigeria that wouldn't be surprising. There may be stocks in other countries, but nothing to make a huge difference, I think, in the overall balance of supply and demand. So what we're looking at is starting the year in a fairly positive situation, starting the year in a position where demand looks strong, prices look attractive, stocks look low. We need good crops. We need to make sure that this demand can be supplied in 2021 and beyond. and we've something very difficult to deal with, as we all know. We've this incredible crisis that has now very sadly caused over 2 million deaths, over 100 million cases worldwide. What does this mean for the cashew business as things stand? Let's just look briefly. I don't intend, and I'm not qualified to analyze a pandemic, but let's just look quickly at the impact in some of the cashew countries. So Vietnam continues with pretty low cases, some restrictions, but the business of processing cashews, importing and exporting, has continued remarkably successfully. In India, there has been recently a sharp fall in cases. I'm reading of claims of herd immunity, which would be terrific, of course, and people asking, is the worst over? Note of caution, in Europe, we thought the worst was over last September, October, but actually the worst was only on its way. If we look in West Africa, I think it's still fair to say that the pandemic generally has been less deadly in West Africa due to prompt action by governments, due to a strong community buy-in, due to the demographics, and probably the exception is unfortunately South Africa. But if we look across the continent, business has been able to continue. People have suffered a lot of disruption, but the cashew business has generally continued. And I suppose it's worth saying that in 2020, processors who did open, who did take the necessary precautions to protect their staff, were rewarded for that. There has been a good shift in demand to West African cashew processing, particularly in the second half of 2020, and that's been growing in momentum as the year has gone on. Look, in China, it appears to be, from what you read, it's business as usual. You read occasional outbreaks and disruption as a result, but it would appear to be under control and business is continuing. Here in Europe, in midwinter, and a very cold winter it is too, we were hit hard by a third wave. Many countries thought that by the end of 2020, this would be far less impactful than it has been. But the last couple of months have been very strong impact with severe lockdowns in many countries. Business has, of course, continued, but it has had a huge impact on people with high death rates, high numbers of cases, and a difficult situation all around. And that continues, although vaccinations are now happening in most countries, and it's slowly rolling out in some countries a little bit quicker in others. North America, of course, heavily impacted. Cases are now falling. Vaccination is started. And it does appear that North America, Europe, it's probably sometime in the third quarter, we'll see I'm not going to say return to normal, but a return to something like normal, and that will progress from now. But most governments are saying that they will lift restrictions fairly slowly. Now, if we are a little bit selfish and just focus on our own business, it's fairly clear that the pandemic hasn't had a bad impact on demand in Europe or North America during 2020. And there's no real reason at the moment to think that might change. But let's look at some of the factors that we should consider during 2021. The vaccinations will reduce the need for restrictions. The economic impact is unclear. A lot of people believe that this will be a short, sharp recession because the amount of money in the system is high, interest rates remain low. I'm specifically talking about Western countries. And there is a good chance that the impact will be hard but short. And that's certainly a number of people are saying that. They are talking about, if we look at price sensitive markets, I'm back on cashews, particularly price sensitive markets such as India, United States, markets where price is a major factor. I mean, price is a major factor everywhere, but where price is the determining factor. they may be impacted in terms of demand during 2021 in the event of a deep recession. If we look at the longer term impact, I've been reading a lot of analysis telling us that the longer term economic impact in Africa is predicted, and we're yet to see how that might impact. Obviously, although less affected than Europe, for example, there's a cost to that. And we'll have to see how that rolls out. We'll also have to see how the distribution of the vaccines is managed, and whether there's fairness, whether the fairness and equity that they're talking about in the distribution of vaccines actually comes to pass. In other words, that we see people in developing countries get relatively quick access to vaccines. Let's hope it does, but history would tell us that it won't. So we should expect fairly long-term economic impact in Africa. The pandemic has had, of course, an impact on the supply chain, and this was a subject that we talked about last year, but which I think I'd like to return to. I think it's worth highlighting some of the factors that we discussed at that time. Certainly, the pandemic has highlighted the weaknesses and the risk in the supply chain, and particularly the risk of high dependence on a single origin. And let's not forget that given the high level of imports of cashew kernels from Vietnam into the United States and into the European market, and now an increasing reliance in countries like Japan, Australia, and other smaller markets, we only got off by the skin of our teeth last year. If Vietnam had been affected by the pandemic in, for example, the way India was affected by the pandemic, the cashew business would have closed last year. There would be about 2 million tons of cashews lying around the world unprocessed. That is really a shocking perspective. Think of what that would do to farm gate prices in 2021 all around the world. Think of what that would do to longer term demand. So all of those Europeans, Americans, Chinese, who've been buying cashews and buying more cashews in more countries than ever before, they would not have been able to access that product, and they would have moved on to something else. So we have to ask ourselves, in the new cashew world, do we want to trust to luck in the future? And that's the way, pandemics are like that. I mean, it is good management for sure, but it's also a little bit of luck that Vietnam wasn't affected in the same way that other countries were. And it's not only pandemics that disrupt markets. So the risk of dependence on single origin, the risk of long chains of distribution, meaning the chain from West Africa to Asia and back to markets in developed countries, has been a real demonstration of the risk in the system. It's renewed interest, and I can tell you this from personal experience dealing with processors in West Africa in a range of functions over the last 6-8 months. It has introduced more interest in traceability, more interest in a kind of a much more transparent way of doing business, interest in shorter, nearer supply chains, and interest in agile supply chains that are equipped to withstand shocks. I don't believe that these factors will bring an overnight change in the industry, but I think that it has signaled to many people that if they haven't already done so, that it's time to take a long look at the way cashews are sourced and a long look at the way this market is managed. So let's have a look at some of the longer term impacts and some of the longer term changes that may come about, and which we can see actually coming about very slowly in recent years, but now beginning to gain some momentum. So always in the past, the focus was simply on cost efficiency. just in time, lean, focus on cost, get the price down. That'll make business run. What we're seeing now is much more of a focus on stronger supply chains, on resilience in the supply chain, and adaptability in the supply chain. I mean, take for example, the impact on freight, the current impact on freight of the pandemic and the lack of availability of containers in Asian countries. So freight on cashews, on a container of cashew kernels to Europe or the United States, has increased by somewhere between 10 and 12 cents a pound. And now if we look at our market over the last 2 months, the market hasn't changed by 10 or 12 cents a pound, but the price has gone up, the cost has gone up by the cost of the freight. And that's a direct impact of the pandemic. And it's a direct impact, in our case, of high dependence on a particular origin as part of our supply chain at a level of 90% for US buyers, for example. The crisis, the health, social and economic crisis has refocused people's minds. They've started to look at sustainability differently. I mean, the pandemic reminds us that the world is not a predictable, controllable place. Businesses realize that they have to adjust, and they're good at adjusting, and they're doing that now. And this is the trends that we're seeing. We're also seeing that developing countries have done better, particularly in Africa. I mean, even if we look at countries, we look at India, where it was very badly affected by the pandemic, but the actual death rate was not as bad as in developed countries. So this is bringing people's focus a little bit differently. And we're also seeing people look at social inequality and seeing it a little bit more clearly. It's very, very clear when you look at the cashew world. Just look at the cashew world. Leave all the other issues aside and look at the inequality in this market, how clear that's become during the pandemic. We're looking at a changing supply chain. We're looking at a supply chain that works, and it did work in 2020. But we need to ask ourselves, are we thinking long term? Is this the way that this market is best organized over the long term? And that for me is the key question coming from the analysis of demand, the analysis of the impact of the pandemic on the cashew sector in 2020. Okay, let's focus in on a few more pragmatic issues. Let's have a look at production in 2021. Currently, as you can see, we're predicting production to be a little bit better in 2021. So we've done an analysis which looks at the low estimates and the high estimates. So we have some very optimistic and ambitious estimates from some official sources, and we have some less optimistic from trade sources. And we just done an analysis of those, and there is quite a gap between the two, as you can see. So in 2021, as we've seen lower crops in East Africa, it looks as if the Tanzanian crop could be as low as 225,000 tons. Initial estimates were at one point 300,000, then 290, then 250, then 230. It looks about 225. Most of that's already in the market. We know it. The estimates from Mozambique look like, although this is not official, but estimates from Mozambique look to be overstated to me. Perhaps they were also last year, and it looks like for reasons of the weather, the cyclone recently, the impact of security emergency is going to reduce the crop there. So lower crops in East Africa in general. In Vietnam, it seems, and there are conflicting stories. Officially, there's a crop estimate of 360,000 tons, which officially is down by 30,000 tons on last year. That the crop is likely to be later is also spoken about in some areas. So possibly later, probably lower, and we'll see the impact of that on the market during March and April. Cambodia is a really interesting case. In Cambodia, they're again forecasting a higher crop. I spoke to someone on Monday telling me that they expected a crop of about 250,000 tons, but it could be more than that. That's again an increase. That is 95, 98% exported to Vietnam for processing, and it is the Cambodian crop that will act as the bridge between the end of the Tet holidays and processing getting started again and the arrival of the Vietnamese crop. So this is a very important, really this is the fulcrum on which this market turns at the moment. What happens in Cambodia in February and Vietnam in March determines what happens in West Africa for the rest of the year because it sets the tone. So between them, you're looking at about 17% of world production. But the psychological impact on processors who need to buy maybe 1.5, 1.6 million tons of raw cashew nuts is enormous. And that tends to set the tone in the way that people set out to buy their RCN in that year. India, I think the crop is likely to return to what we might consider normal to good crop. There's no indication that it would be the bumper crop that we saw, 3 years ago? But it should be a normal crop. And people are telling me that the crop is likely to be a little bit late. That does vary. I mean, it's a big country and cashews are produced in quite a widespread area, but generally that's what I'm hearing. And that could have an impact in March and April. Probably not as big an impact, that the lateness won't have as big an impact as it might in Vietnam, but it will have an impact, and we may see some impact of that in March and April. So a better crop, certainly a better crop than 2020, than 2019, and with the potential for a very good crop. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later when we get to some of the risk factors. Let's have a look at Africa in 2021, and we see positive trend in the production in West Africa over the last 5 or 6 years. 2021 looks the same. Again, the comparison of high and low estimates. Probably the reality is somewhere in between, but let's see. At the moment, most countries forecasting a good crop, as they tend to do at this time of year. If we look at Cote d'Ivoire, very good projection, 900,000 tons is the official estimate, which means, again, Cote d'Ivoire will be the world's largest producer of cashew nuts. And on this basis, a 1 million ton crop can't be too many years away, although growth is not likely to be very fast. We're getting to a stage now where trees are aging, trees need to be replaced, and after 3 or 4 years of low enough prices, we may not see the growth that we would otherwise see. Tanzania, we've talked about, a lower crop than expected. Nigeria forecasting a very good crop. The crop forecast figure is around about the same figure as it was pre-pandemic in 2020. It's around about the same level as the 2019 crop, a good crop. Of course, in Nigeria, how much is collected is often determined by where prices are. And we should see, looking over the next month, how that develops. And finally, then in Ghana, again, a good crop predicted. And I would expect that Ghana will grow in production and its share of the market in the coming years. If we look at where that leaves Africa overall, it looks to me as if the African share of production this year will be somewhere in the region of 54%. That would be slightly down because we're seeing a return to a normal crop factored in there for India, which would reduce the percentage, but nonetheless, more than half the world's cashews produced in African countries, and most of those in West Africa. Elsewhere, not a great deal of change. Brazil about the same as last year, not much change, perhaps a little bit disappointing. Look at it longer term, and we took a little bit of a look of the 2021 estimate, compared it to the previous 3 years, and you can see general trends here. So East Africa, generally falling production. That could be reversed, but generally falling production. Brazil's stable, slight rise, but stable. It will, I think, rise again, but it's not to the levels that we saw in the 1990s. Vietnam and Cambodia, production growth, apart from a very good year last year in Vietnam, generally production growth in the region is driven by Cambodia. Cambodian cashew production has risen from about 80,000 tons 10 years ago to more than 250,000 tons in 2021. So that's quite significant growth. However, again, we should be aware that low prices for the past 2 years may well impact on the increase in production in Cambodia. Were new trees planted in the last 2 or 3 years? Probably nowhere near as many as were planted in the previous 5 or 6 years. We look at India, a little bit of volatility. I think perhaps we should exclude last year if we look at the trend, but in general in India, we're not seeing a steady increase in production. There have been many, over the years, many different projects to increase production, but it does appear that Indian cashew farmers are not increasing the number of cashews they grow. They're quite efficient as they are. They would need to plant more trees, and that doesn't appear to be happening, probably because there are more attractive products out there for them at this time. And in West Africa, and here I suppose we might need to introduce a note of caution, because if we look at West African production, we're not seeing the level of growth in recent years as we saw in the previous 5 years. So we cannot assume that West Africa will continue to be in a position to supply enough cashews to meet the increases in demand. And this bearing in mind that the driver of world cashew production over the last 10 years has been West Africa. If that stalls, then we're quite likely to see a real tightening of supply and demand, because I can tell you consumers, they don't know and they don't care about whether there's enough cashews in the world when they go to the store. They don't think about that. They buy the product, and they will continue to buy the product until such time as either it prices itself out or there's another reason not to buy it. So it seems that this is beginning to tighten. We predicted this back in 2015. If you were at the World Cashew Convention in 2015, we were saying this was going to happen. It seems to be happening now. There are, and let's be clear, there are projects that could change this. In Benin, in Ghana, continuing in Cote d'Ivoire, there are opportunities to increase production. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. When we judge based on what we know, and what we know is what's happened in recent years, it doesn't look as if that is going to respond very quickly. So a note of caution on supply in the coming 5 years. So Africa 2021, generally these are the trends that I'm expecting. More processing, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Nigeria. We've seen announcements of realistic farm gate prices in Cote d'Ivoire at CFA 305 per kilo. And I'm expecting that we will soon hear an announcement of a realistic price in Benin, which should facilitate trade, whilst at the same time rewarding farmers quite well. Good crops in West Africa, generally lower than forecast in East Africa, as we've said. We are also going to see regulatory development. Governments in Benin, Ghana, as well as other countries are looking at how they may move in the cashew sector to make it work more effectively, and particularly to look after their farmers more effectively. And they are generally positive moves. People are talking, people are thinking, and there are now established forums for those discussions. So we are seeing quite positive moves, and that's evidenced by more realistic farm gate pricing this year. And I think that's a key factor, because in the past we've not seen, in many countries we've seen no regulation or no support, and in other countries we've seen very poor regulation. So the market outlook for 2021, entering the year with tight supplies, fundamentally strong demand. The demand, as I've said, is not due simply to the pandemic lockdowns, therefore the trend will not change. as the pandemic ebbs. Key factor is the timing and of course the size of the Vietnamese crop. The current forecast is for a good crop, a little bit less than last year from official sources in Vietnam. It does look, given the tight supply situation and good demand, it does look that buyers of RCN must come to the market in good time. So if you think about it, if it's about 80 days minimum to get product from the point of purchase to processing, buyers need to act relatively quickly. So Indian buyers would need to act to fill a gap between old crop and new crop. They'll look probably in Benin and Ghana perhaps, and Vietnamese buyers will possibly need to act a little bit earlier than they did last year and a little bit more quickly. And they, of course, will tend more to look in Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire. Cashew kernels, well, you don't need me to tell you, prices are attractive. Cashews are, I think, fundamentally undervalued. And I don't mean at $3 a pound, and I don't mean at $3.20 a pound. I mean, they're undervalued. Probably prices should be up around $4 a pound. But that's not to say the market is going there. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that fundamentally, based on what we know, based on demand trends, cashew kernels are attractive and they're probably undervalued. I think demand will grow. I expect that it would be more slowly. Well, won't it? Because it's gone very quick. Is that going to change? It may not. It's quite possible that demand would grow in 2021 as quickly as it grew in 2020. At consumption level, it doesn't work in the same way. They don't slow it or speed it up. They do what they need to do. And so it's quite likely that we could see fast growth. And buyers still have to buy some kernels. They have reasonably good cover, I think, for the early part of the year, but they will need to take some action then. So if we look at this in the market, outlook 2021, all the factors for growth are there. The pandemic is beginning to wane. The vaccines will eventually take effect. There's a question mark over what will the economic impact of that be? How will that affect consumer spending? How will that affect organization of markets? And there is this factor of late crops in Asia, in the big producers, India, and of course in Vietnam and Cambodia, the possibility of late crops, possibly adding a little bit of spice to the mix, let's say, and possibly causing uncertainty and a certain amount of volatility in the market during this year. That's my overall outlook for the year. I wanted to touch on how might this be disrupted? What could be the factors that would disrupt this? The outliers, the disruptors, are the black swans as they're known. Well, first of all, and highly likely, a depending on where you live, a third or even a fourth wave of the coronavirus is a factor that could impact the market. We see new variants spoken about in the press. We're not sure how they might be impacted by the vaccines. We don't know is the fact, but this is something that needs to be kept a close eye on, and particularly the possibility that we would see a stronger outbreak in Vietnam or in India again. And this is major factor to be watched. There is the possibility of a price spiral if you consider the ingredients. Number one, low levels of stock. Number two, strong demand growth. Number three, low prices. Number four, the chance of a disruption to crops. That could create, and I'm not predicting this, I'm saying this is an outlier, a disruptor, a possible event. This could cause prices to start to move quickly and perhaps to move out of control. Less likely, but also possible, we could see a surge in Chinese nut demand. Very interestingly, US market reports on China US government analysis of the Chinese market is showing a spike in the demand for edible nuts, and particularly in bakery products, which is interesting. And we could then see a possible spike in Chinese demand. And as you know, if you follow other nuts, if you follow almonds, if you follow pecans, you know what that can do. That can cause a huge bubble in demand. That can have an impact on supply and demand very quickly. Other factors, I think this is going to happen. There's going to be a labor scandal in factories. If it's not in 2021, it'll be sometime in the future. A lot of factories in certain countries are not following the rules they should. And this is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's simply a matter of when. Keep an eye on it. It can have a negative impact. If you're a processor, make sure that you're compliant. If you're a market player, keep an eye on this. This can have an impact. It can have an impact on demand. It can have an impact on processing volumes. Will brokens make a comeback? Maybe. There's still big stocks of brokens. There's big stocks in Vietnam, big stocks in East Africa. Demand has been poor. It's been affected, of course, by food service. That will start to return in 2021. But I think there's a chance that there will be a strong growth in the demand for brokens. We have seen low prices for this product for a long time, long enough to stimulate interest. So this needs to be watched. And we're seeing maybe a little hint of it right now, but not too much. Needs to be watched as the year goes on. It would take a lot of strain off the market if there was, for example, a surge in bakery demand for nuts in China, and that they decided that they would buy brokens to fill that. That could make a big difference. Point to be watched. And the final factor, which is a bit of it's an outlier, let's say, but La Nina. So La Nina is a climate phenomenon. I'll show you a little bit about it. So La Nina is a climate phenomenon experienced between December and February. As you can see, it has an impact in different parts of the world. So in Southeast Asia, it causes wet weather. In West Africa, it causes cool weather. And this is a long shot, because at the moment, crop predictions are pretty good. So let's not react to this yet, but like all of these outliers and disruptors, we need to keep an eye on them to see where they could lead. But if I had a look back over the other La Nina years, and three big years for La Nina were 1998, 2007, and 2010. And you can see in those years, there was an impact on the crop. In the 99 Vietnamese crop, which would be the equivalent of this year, was a poor crop for the same reason, La Nina. 2007, there was virtually no impact, or a very low impact. And in 2010, there was quite a strong impact in India and in Vietnam. Both had smaller than usual crops. And I guess if you're around long enough, you'll remember what happened in 2011. Cashew prices went sky high. A note of caution. This is not a prediction. These are not facts. These are potential outliers and disruptors, things that might happen. So let's not get too tied up in it, but these are factors to track in the market. That's my general outlook. I'm going to add another factor for the end. I'm going to look further forward. What's the outlook? And I'm just calling this my big trends and dead ends for the 2020s. Big factors, big trends that may happen over the next 10 years. These are what I see as big trends. Shorter supply chains, closer supply chains. Labor rights becoming a big factor, that workers would be properly treated, properly rewarded, and that their health and safety will be looked after in cashew factories all around the world. Sustainable packaging. Recyclable. A lot of our packaging is not recyclable at the moment. That needs to be addressed. The development of more technology and processing. And we're beginning to see developments in this area. So what we've seen so far is the mechanization of processing. And what we're beginning to see is the application of technology. So better transit systems, better monitoring in factories, more automated processing. I think that's going to be a trend in the next 10 years. That's the logical place for this process to go. And finally, I think a big trend in the next 10 years will be organic cashew kernels. It's a small part of the market now, maybe depending on where you live, between 4 and 6%, but growing quickly and has the potential to grow. And there is a potential to indeed increase certified organic production. And just to clarify, it's not organic unless it's certified. So this is something that I think is well worth looking at over the coming years. And we're in a good position in this sector to take advantage of this trend. Those are my big trends for the 2020s. And these are my dead ends. These are things which I think are going nowhere. Number one, the trade in Burma kernels. I find this, frankly, I find it a bit of a scam. I think that is a dead end. I think the experience, number two, on warehouse receipt systems and raw cashew nut auctions, if they are part of a regulatory system, if they're rigid, the experience has shown that they don't work. We saw a disaster really in Tanzania over 2 years. You know, and unfortunately, we saw 2 years of really disastrous actions wrapped up to look as if they were great triumphs, and they weren't. They had big impact on the market, they had big impact locally. Production is going down. Processing in Tanzania is virtually finished at this moment in time. And it could be one of the great processing centers. Number three, labor abuse. Corollary of the proper treatment of workers, not working properly with workers is going to cause problems, needs to change. The failure to use byproducts is a dead end. I think everyone knows that, and that needs to be addressed. It needs to be changed. I'm glad to see some factories in West Africa doing that. It's always been done in India. It's been done in Vietnam. It needs to be done everywhere. So an end to the piles of shells sitting outside factories across African countries. And number five, and ACA is doing their bit on this one, a dead end is the manipulation by rumor and poor market intelligence. So we've tried to do our bit for that, but this is a real dead end. This does nobody any good. It's a factor of short-term speculation. So those are my dead ends, and I hope to see them knocked on the head during the next decade. That's it from me. I think we enter 2021 with quite an optimistic picture. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's always a pleasure to go through the analysis with you. We will now move straight into the Q&A session. For today's session, actually, we are not receiving any direct interventions from other experts. So it will be more the Q&A, and then we give you the opportunity to respond. To the participants, please be reminded that you may post your questions using the Q&A feature, or you can also use the raise hand feature, and we'll call you and allow you to also show your video if you want to. But Jim, to come back to the Q&A, there is a comment that was made by one participant, and it's also linked to a question that is there on the Q&A box. The participant said, wow, with the ongoing analysis by our speaker, Jim, it seems there's high demand across the world, and this could lead to price increases as we progress in this cashew season 2021. So this is where I want to know whether there's no word of caution that should be sounded to statements of this nature, but then take that together with the question whether you anticipate any RCN farm gate prices in West Africa to increase due to crop failure in Eastern and West and Southern Africa. So the expression or the comments about your statement suggesting that there are going to be price increases, and also the question here whether you anticipate any farm gate price increase in West Africa as a result of crop failure in East and Southern Africa.
No, I don't anticipate any farm gate price rise in West Africa due to crop failure in East Africa, because we already know about the crop situation in East Africa, and that is already factored into the market. So it will not have a direct impact. And by the way, I didn't say there was a crop failure in East Africa. I said there were reduced crops in East Africa. It's not a bad crop at all. It's certainly not a failure. I just noticed that in the text.
And I think to avoid situations where suddenly people are clamoring for higher prices because then there has been a webinar where some statements have been made, I think it should also be clear to participants that prices are also a factor of many other elements and other trends and demand, supply, and other issues in other geographical areas. So wherever you are located, whatever happens to the price there will depend on a number of these factors. And so there can't be any such blanket statement that there will be increases in prices, particularly prices of RCN, as a result of some of the trends that we have mentioned here. Just to put that kind of a caveat there.
Yeah, I mean, let's be very clear about this. Is it true that cashew kernels are probably undervalued at this moment in time? Yes, it is. Based on the history, that would suggest that they are undervalued. Can you say the same thing of RCN? Absolutely not. You cannot say the same about RCN. In fact, RCN prices at the moment may well not reflect the value of kernels at the moment. So if you want to go speculating on the basis, on RCN, on the basis that I think that demand is strong, you're making a mistake. This is not a formula for speculation. This is a statement of optimism for the market for 2021. I not only do I not recommend speculation, I think speculation should be avoided. Do your business, do what makes sense for your business, avoid speculation. Because look at this big factor, potential disruptors. COVID-3, COVID-4, this can have a huge impact on the market. It's very easy for us to look at market information and to think of the things that are optimistic or make prices rise. And you can pick those out as much as you want. And at this time of year, we do hear, if we go back this time last year, if you think of the World Cashew Convention in Abidjan last year, we heard a lot of negatives. And they turned out to have an adverse impact on the market, which probably should have been higher throughout the year. So let's not take market information as a reason for speculation. That's a destructive way to look at business. Let's look at the market information and think there's an opportunity here to develop value addition and cashew products in African countries. Ernest.
Thank you, Jim. Earlier in your presentation, you talked about consumption growing in the US, EU, and other locations, but those consumption growth rates were below the trend. Now the question is that, are there assumptions we have made in all these trend estimations which need to be thought through again, whether we have to rethink all these assumptions? What specific assumptions do you think we have considered in the past which are not playing out now? Because again, if the demand is even, like you said, more than 8% in the US, very significant growth in consumption, then we want to know what are we not looking at rightly in terms of the assumptions that we have held over the years.
Well, I think going back to the comments about the United States market, the growth in the US market has been slow. I said that in the course of the presentation. Last year, that changed and growth was quick. And the question is, was the growth in the United States market last year solely due to the pandemic, or are other factors at play? I think that growth in the United States at 8% is not sustainable, that it will return to a slower level of growth. On the other hand, the European market has grown very quickly in recent years, and that's not going to reverse itself very quickly. That is going to continue. So I'm seeing, my prediction is continued strong growth in the European market and return to slow growth in the US market. This would have been pretty much the assumptions that we would have been working on over the last 10 years. Slow growth in the US, faster growth in Europe. We did not expect European growth to be as quick as it has been in 2019 and 2020. Looking at China, we are seeing an increase in growth. But that asks more of a question. And the question is, can the type of growth that we've seen in almonds, in pecans, and other products in China, can this happen in cashews? If it does, it's a game changer. So I don't think that we've seen any real change in the direction of trends, but what we have seen is an increase in the momentum behind those trends. So demand is growing quicker, not just in 2020, but over the last 3 or 4 years, demand is growing quicker than it was growing in the previous 3 or 4 years. And I think that's going to continue.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. I would like to also do some kind of a drill down here. When you were talking about salmon 2020, you also mentioned that the price collapse was not demand driven. I would like to find out any possible ideas what could have contributed to the price collapse then, because I think we may pretty much be looking at a similar year in 2021. So if it is not demand driven, what is contributing to this price collapse that we experienced for 2020 for kernels?
Okay, so let's just put a few basics down. First of all, if we see strong demand, we would expect that prices would be strong in relation to that demand, particularly if supply hasn't increased. So we're looking at the balance between supply and demand as an indicator of prices. That's the basic. In 2020, we saw demand very strong. Supply was not especially strong. It was good, but it wasn't especially strong, and yet prices fell. Why did that happen? This was one of our preoccupations during these events last year, and we talked about areas. We talked about, I believe, the panic during the early part of the pandemic when prices did collapse. We talked about the impact of basically a misread of how demand would behave in importing markets. So much of the read on the market at that time was that, well, if Europeans or Americans to a lesser extent, if they're in a lockdown situation, if their income is restricted, then they're not going to buy cashew nuts. But in actual fact, what happened was that people did. And maybe it was a misinterpretation of consumer behavior. Maybe it was a misinterpretation of what lockdowns mean. Maybe it was, and I think this was a big factor, it was sheer panic. But there was also an element of, a trend that had started back before the pandemic really started to bite in January and February. And the trend was an effort to knock down RCN prices in order to cover short positions. So processors had heavily sold forward at good prices, probably averaging around $3.40, maybe a little bit more for 320s, and they needed to buy the RCN to cover that, and they were naturally talking the price down. And in my dead ends, one of my dead ends is misinformation and market management by rumor, and that was a typical example of that. So we should look at 2020 as a very specific year. I don't believe that we are in a similar situation this year. There is a chance of continued negative impact of the pandemic. That could even get worse, but we're no longer dealing with an unknown. We're dealing with a lot of things much better informed in a lot of ways than we were this time last year. This time last year, we just didn't know what was coming. Now, generally in business, we have some idea of what's coming. And that's important, particularly on the demand side. So I don't think it is the same situation. I think that it is clear that prices are attractive. I think it's clear that demand is strong. The question mark is whether or not supply will be disrupted. That for me is the big question. We could talk about the impact of a recession on cashew demand. No one can foretell the future, but history tells us that the impact of recessions on cashew demand tends to be light and short-lived. And if you want to go back to the deepest recession of recent times after the financial crisis in 2008, 9, and 10, you would see that actually, although there was a pause, particularly in the second half of 2008, demand quickly rebounded. And when you look at demand in 2011, so we shouldn't necessarily, we shouldn't assume that recession impacts demand and means lower prices, nor should we assume that because demand is strong, that RCN prices will go up at the farm gate or elsewhere. It's just not a fact.
Thank you, Jim. Can we go back to your slide on the disruptions and stay a bit with demand? Here, good. Jim, I don't find demand among the, yes, you talked about Chinese nut demand, but then I see supply is factored in the La Nina. But then how likely is a slump or a fall in demand a possible disruptor in 2021? Because the picture looks like it's all rosy with demand is going to probably also continue to grow in that way. But how likely is it a potential disruptor in 2021?
Well, I think first of all, let's bear in mind that buyers tend to cover forward. So a lot of the demand is already locked in. Okay. Number one. Number two, we could consider what are the potential disruptors to demand. And there are always disruptors, and we can't include them all, but let's say what could disrupt demand? Would high prices, would a rise in prices disrupt demand during 2021? I very much doubt it. Business is done forward, business is committed. High prices might impact profit margins along the chain, but it's unlikely to impact demand. The COVID could, of course, impact the demand for RCN if there was a pandemic issue in processing countries. That could be a major factor. But that would only affect initially RCN, and then later it would affect kernels. What else could impact demand? It's quite difficult. I mean, a product scandal, we've seen that in other products. We've seen it in peanuts once or twice over the years, where there would be a food safety issue that could affect demand. As I look at it now, I don't see many factors that can be negative for demand in 2021. Of course, if you go into the following year, if you go into 2022, everything is open again. So if we had high prices in 2021, that would impact demand in 2022. But right now, I don't see many possible negative impacts on demand. I think I look at situations like the price of brokens. I think it's particularly on cheaper end brokens, I think it's probably as bad as it's going to get. I look at the value of 320s, the main grade used by snack food manufacturers. And I think at these prices, this works. They would have some good forward cover on at current market prices, a little lower too. And there is a hunger for that product in supermarkets and markets around the world. So I don't see major negative disruptors on the demand side, with the exception of something dramatic, food safety scandal, which is possible, by the way, a labor scandal in factories, which is also possible, and that they could have a negative impact on demand. but demand looks positive, and that's one of the reasons I concentrated on demand this year in this presentation, because sometimes this factor is neglected in discussions. People are always, they tend to more focus on supply.
Thank you, Jim. I want to stay with this slide and then look more at the labor scandal in factories. It is really for the sake of institutions that are intervening in the sector, particularly in Africa. And the clarification that I seek here is that what exactly are the issues? Is it about factories not following? Indeed, what you had said was that factories were not following the rules they should.
Yes.
And we want a clarification. Is it about wages or is it about health protocols? What exactly are the issues so that we will know how to intervene and to mitigate any future scandal, which you mentioned as a possible or potential disruptor for 2021?
Yeah, well, let me say, first of all, that I don't think practices in African factories are particularly poor. This comment is not necessarily directed at African factories at all.
Okay.
I think that the chances of a labor scandal is less likely to come from Africa than it is from other parts of the world. What are the problems? I think what we've seen is in the separation of shelling and the rest of the process, we've seen labor working conditions, health and safety, wages, the observance of laws on child labor. Some of the standards in those shelling plants in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, have slipped, and that there are factors there, and it's, we don't know how many factories, but we know there are some that don't play by the rules, that would be acceptable. And let me say this, either in their own country or amongst buyers of kernels. So this is not just some businesses abusing international protocols, they're also abusing the laws of their own country. And that is a factor. And this is not something that applies to most cashew nut factories. Absolutely not. This is not something that applies to all cashew producing or processing countries. But it is a factor. And evidence has been in the past that it only takes one or two high profile cases to have an overall impact on demand. Again, what I see in West Africa in the newer factories is good. I see people taking it seriously. There's room for improvement, of course, and people are aware of that. And a lot of organizations like your own, Ernest, are doing good things to publicize how that should be done. What I'm really saying is that at some point, buyers will not tolerate this risk, and they want to make sure that something is done about it. And we as a sector need to encourage that.
Thank you, Jim. Let me go to the last set of questions on your big trends and also the dead ends. There's a question here that is asking that you're talking about shorter supply chains being one of the big trends. And how do you see this happening? And what role do you think Africa will be playing in this?
Well, it seems logical that, but having said that, it's always been logical
Exactly.
that the processing would be located closer to the production. And given that the production is closer to the market, it seems to make very little sense. From any point of view, but from a sustainability point of view, but also from an economic point of view, it makes very little sense that cashews would be shipped. You may recall one of the slides we showed last year, the 28,000 kilometer journey of a cashew kernel. It doesn't really make any sense. The risk, the potential for disruption, the loss of quality. Just even simply, how many people have ever eaten a fresh cashew nut at destination? Most of the cashew nuts in the supermarkets for the second half of the year would be 3, 4, 5, 6 months old. And that's obviously, it's not possible to have them very quickly. That's a function of international distribution, but certainly a shorter supply chain would make that possible. So it's more environmentally sustainable. It makes more economic sense to have shorter supply chains. our long supply chains evolved in cashew nuts because the opportunity to quickly develop processing in African countries wasn't there in the past. The introduction of mechanization has made that easier. The greater interest in investment in African countries had made it more possible. And we're seeing the fruits of that in countries in West Africa now. And we have seen it in the past in Mozambique, which it comes and goes in Mozambique, but we've seen it there in the past too. So shorter supply chains make sense. So that might mean that countries process the cashews they grow. It might mean that the factories move to the production. It could mean that production increases in the processing countries, but we haven't seen that happen. So we haven't seen, for example, production increase dramatically in Vietnam, nor have we seen that in India. So at this moment in time, if we talk about shorter supply chains, what it means is processing closer to where the product is grown.
Thank you very much, Jim. On the dead end, and that would be my last question. There's no other question in the Q&A box. Number one is the Burma kernels. And really, if you can shed some more light on this, because it's an African processing dilemma. And the trend we were beginning to see was more of, beginning to have certain use for Burma kernel, and also being addressed in a way that at least it doesn't impact negatively on the local processing. So if you can really shed a bit more light on this and what the options are for African processing, given the scenario you are going to paint. Thank you.
Well, first of all, the best option is to process the cashew kernels close to where they grow. And that means to fully process them. Burma kernels doesn't really answer the problem of long supply chains. In fact, shipping Burma kernels are unpeeled kernels, so they're shelled, but they're not peeled, in case anyone's unclear. So shipping those increases the food safety risk because the product is not protected any longer by the shell. It allows for, and we've seen it, and if you look in depth at the trade in Burma kernels, you see that there are all kinds of fiscal abuses. Subsidies on partially processed kernels, avoiding import duties by declaring the Burma kernels incorrectly, all kinds of things going on that were going on. But I think now that the trade in Burma kernels come under scrutiny, very much so in India and also more recently in Vietnam. I think it will end. The option for African processors is to develop good quality processing. It is not a long-term solution to do the part processing in Africa. In my opinion, this was never a good idea. It was more or less an exploitation of the rules. And I think that from every point of view, ranging from food safety all the way through, it would be a positive long-term solution to do what factories, and we see good factories in West Africa. If we look at Talaro, if we look at Fludor in Benin, if we look at factories like SG Agro or Ayan Cajou in Cote d'Ivoire, we see factories doing full processing, producing brilliant quality products and operating in a full processing mode. That's the future. Burma kernels increases the food safety risk, doesn't solve the traceability problem, only partially solves the environmental impact. It doesn't really get us anywhere now. Maybe 20 years ago, it would have been a good idea, but it didn't happen 20 years ago. It only happened in the last 4 or 5 years. So that's why I think it's a dead end.
Jim, in the number 2, and I'm not going to go through the whole list, I take only the second one, where you're talking about the warehouse receipts, and then there are certain options. And not to create a situation where people are confusing it for the necessity for governments to have warehousing facilities for cashew. Can you shed a bit more light on that? Because I think these are distinct systems. Having warehouses for cashew in Africa is becoming a necessity, but probably the mechanism of buying and pricing around it, which then becomes the warehousing receipt and the auctions, is in my mind what you are considering a dead end here. If you can throw some more light.
Yeah. So let's be very clear about what we mean here. So first of all, if we talk about warehouses, we're talking about infrastructure. Infrastructure is obviously important. It's lacking in the cashew sector in African countries, especially in West Africa, and that does need to be addressed and is being addressed. That's about building good quality warehouses that can handle the raw material as part of the process of getting it to market. What I'm talking about in the dead ends is warehouse receipt systems and RCN auctions. These are not warehouses as such. These are marketing systems, the way governments tend to try and control the marketing of the product. So we can see examples. If we look in, I'll quote you two examples. Firstly, the Tanzanian cashew auction. It's not altogether clear that the Tanzanian cashew auction has actually impacted farm gate prices positively. And it's quite clear that the government in Tanzania has struggled, before the reform of the system, struggled deeply with marketing the product, to the point where in 2 years in a row, we had 100 and 200,000 tons unsold. If we look at another example, if we look at, we go a different product, a different country. In Ethiopia, the commodity exchange deals in sesame seed. Ethiopia produces some of the best sesame seed in the world. A lot of it now gets mixed in, loses quality, loses traceability, loses identity in the warehouse receipt system. It's not proved to be an effective way. And unfortunately, many buyers try and find a way around it. Many sellers cooperate with that, and it has to be reformed. And I think it is undergoing reform. Plus, warehouse receipt systems, RCN auction systems, as part of an official marketing system, invite corruption. So we see Mozambican cashews crossing the border into Tanzania to enter the auction. We see low quality sesame seed delivered into the Ethiopian commodity exchange as high quality sesame seed. These systems, why are they dead ends? They're dead ends because the history tells us they haven't worked very well. This is not a discussion about infrastructure. Infrastructure investment is needed and welcome, and it is a big trend rather than a dead end. But in my personal opinion, and I know it says these are Jim's big trends and dead ends, not ACA's. I think these systems, the way they have been operated, aren't going to see the light of day 10 years from now.
Thank you, Jim. There are two sets of questions that are available here. Somebody talking about containers, but I think I want to put it more at a higher level. How are logistic handlers coping with the current situation, given COVID and everything that is going on? Are they, or what are the issues that are emerging when we take logistic handlers for cashew exports?
Yeah, well, we've seen a shortage of containers. One of the big factors we've seen is that the time to turn a container around at destination, particularly in the US, expanded. So the average turnaround, I'm open to correction on these exact numbers, but the trend is there. I think the average turnaround went from 11 days to 45 days. That caused a restriction in the movement of the containers, a shortage of containers in Asia. And what did shipping lines do? Well, they do what they do. They put the price up. And the price, I think the low price of a 20-foot container, 20-foot dry van from Vietnam, I think the low price was $700. And I think it's risen to something in the region of $3,500. That's a big difference on price. And that's about supply and demand. So that's about availability of the containers, putting up prices. But elsewhere, we would have to say that there have been disruptions, but these disruptions have really taken a long time to hit the market. So we've seen disruptions like container vessels discharging their containers in Europe in a single port. So instead of calling to a range of ports, they've called to one port, picked up the empties and headed straight back to China. That's been happening. In general, though, if we look at the big picture over the year, distribution of foodstuffs has worked quite well. There have been slowdowns and failures, but it wouldn't be possible for the trade and the demand to have been so positive if distributors and logistics companies had not managed the situation quite well. But what it has signaled to them, and I'm going back to the cashew factor, in cashews, we are only talking positively because Vietnam did not get badly impacted by coronavirus. If Vietnamese cashew factories were forced to close, this cashew world would look a very different place today. And that is for me, that's a risk factor that needs to be addressed.
Jim, there is a questioner, Stefan, who asked a number of questions, but I think for the sake of getting people well educated on the sector, I'm going to really crave my indulgence to read the questions before I move on to the other questions. Here, the first one is, which is the present, or really what is the present shelling capacity in Africa? And by shelling capacity is talking about fully processed kernel. So the shelling capacity in Africa, and how did this change over the past years, and how has there been, and whether there has been any negative effect of coronavirus. I'm sure you might have talked about all these in the past month and even today, all the effects, but maybe you can still sum it up for the questioner. Then the second part of his question is about what bomber kernels are. Actually, probably he needs clarification on what they are. We cannot assume that everybody understands and appreciates what is involved. And so if you can clarify this number of issues for him, and I believe for a good number of others who are also participants here.
Africa, so the shelling capacity, Africa processes somewhere in the region of about 7% of its crop at the moment. The capacity would be much higher than that. Most factories aren't operating to capacity. I think if all factories operated to capacity, that figure could be in the region of 20%, but it's nowhere near that right now. Secondly, the trend has been an increase in West Africa. So we've seen new modern factories develop in Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Burkina, and especially in Cote d'Ivoire. We've seen also developments in processing in other countries further west, but not to the same level. That trend is continuing. What's happened is that more modern factories, more mechanized factories have become operational, facilitated by the availability of better technology and better machines, although there is now a question over that too. Has there been a negative effect of coronavirus? There was last year a number of factories in West Africa didn't open, just the same as pretty much everywhere. Some of the factories didn't open, and therefore they were not obviously they didn't process if they didn't open, and processing volumes in those factories were down. Factories that did open did well, and they managed to increase their processed volumes. I think 2021 will be a big year for an increase in processing, especially in Cote d'Ivoire, but also I think better processing volumes in Benin and Nigeria. Burkina too is likely to grow in 2021, maybe towards the end of the year we might see some new processing capacity there. Burma kernels are a cashew kernel where the shell has been removed, but the inner skin or the testa has not been removed. And there has been a trade in, rather than shipping the fully in-shell cashew, in shipping the Burma kernel. And it's complex, the motivations are complex, the reasoning is complex, and my point is that this is not a positive trend going forward.
Thank you, Jim.
Ernest, can I take up one of the questions in the text, if I may?
Yes, yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
I see a question here from Rajiv Kumar. Government
Yes.
interference in prices and large corporations manipulating markets by cornering large quantities of crop. Well, I 100% agree with this. Government interference as opposed to proper regulation and the manipulation of markets by large corporations. I put this down here under my number 5, manipulation by rumor and poor market intelligence. And I think as an industry, we are responsible to make sure that there is good market information to allow people to make better decisions, allowing corporations to, and we have seen this, and let make no mistake, it has happened and has been happening for many years, manipulating information to access perhaps low-priced RCN is absolutely a dead end, and it has been an anchor on this industry for many, many years, and something which we would, I think all of us like to see disappear. And for me, the key to changing that is arming governments with good information that they can make their policy decisions on, and offering good market information to stakeholders in the market to counter some of the manipulation and the rumors. It's a very good point, Rajiv. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Jim. Maybe the last question, then I don't see many more questions. The last question I have here has to do with the new cashew world in the longer term. I want to know, what are the issues specific for Africa, or what would you call the silver bullet if you go to that slide of yours? What would be the silver bullet for Africa? What should we focus on in the longer term, or what will be the key issue in the longer term for Africa?
Well, I think there's a number of issues. The key issues would be, number one, let's recognize that there is room for an increase in production of cashew kernels. And within that, to realize that that means two aspects. There are two types of customer. The customer on the one hand is the African processor who makes kernels and sells them for export. But we should not also forget that the processor abroad will continue to be a customer, and that the processor abroad will continue to play a very important role in the sector. If we increase production in African countries, we hope that processing will also increase, but the markets should be structured so that it can cope with local processing and with the export of raw cashew nuts for processing elsewhere. So if we look at India, for example, it's difficult to export cashew kernels to India, so continue to export RCN is a fact of life. And I think that's the first point. Recognize that an increase in production involves the two types of customer, and that will be with us for years to come. Secondly, I think that the development of good processing practice, and by that I mean the procurement of the right machines, the right structure, the right type of investment, and the right type of work practice in the factories, is important. Just building processes for the sake of processes is not the way forward. They need to be the right ones in the right place. And I think some attention must be given in that context to the development of varied sources of cashew processing equipment and cashew processing technology. There's no standing still. It will move on, and there is always going to be a threat to supply. If we look at big increases in processing capacity, there's always going to be a threat to the supply of the equipment if we have limited sources. So I think the development of processing technology, multi-origin sourcing, the development of indigenous processing industries would be an ideal situation. But if I was to say what is the one single thing for the development of the African cashew sector, I would say it is to think long term. And thinking long-term tends to eliminate speculation. It tends to change the parameters for investment. It tends to improve the quality of investment and therefore the quality of processing. And it tends to stimulate farm production, and it tends to stimulate farm income.
Thank you, Jim. I see a hand up. Isaba Mackinton. Hello, Isaba. Can we activate his mic? Hello, Isaba, are you still there? Okay, the hand has been lowered. So on that note, thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick, once again for your excellent presentation. And we are hoping to see you again on the 3rd of March, where you'll be taking us through crops, demand, and the African cashew for sustainability. So thank you very much for coming and for taking us through. Once again, we also say a big thank you to all our sponsors and partners. Here we're still talking about Intersnack Procurement, Pro Cashew, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, Com Cashew, Cashew Info, and the Benin Cashew Project. So I would also like to remind you once again, 3rd of March is when we are coming your way again, because we want you to also be able to take advantage of the WCC sessions that are coming in the following week. And because for us, it is also to promote learning in the industry. So we want you to get a full opportunity to also participate and to digest the other views that will also come up in that forum. And then we meet you then on the 3rd of March. Again, let me also say that our recorded session will be available on our Facebook and also on our site for you to download. You could also download it from YouTube and to follow the discussions and to be better informed in the coming weeks. We will also leave this platform open for a number of minutes because we are also about networking. We want you to network. We want you to get in touch with others to find out what kind of additional information you want from their specific geographical areas or from their business areas so that you will be able to do business in a better way. Finally, I say to you, COVID is real, and please follow whatever protocols that are there in the regions you are in. And bye-bye, and see you once again.